Welcome to The Joy Report, a podcast dedicated to sharing climate solutions through the lens of intersectionality and optimism. This podcast is brought to you by Intersectional Environmentalist, an eco-media platform dedicated to sharing stories of climate solutions from an inclusive and intersectional perspective. Tune in for a dose of climate joy and actionable steps you can take to stay informed, engaged, and connected to the movement to protect people and the planet. I'm your host, Arielle V, an environmental justice strategist and educator passionate about making environmentalism accessible and irresistible. In the last episode, we explored the effects of artificial intelligence, or AI, and our responsibility as individual users. In this episode, we're continuing our focus on AI to examine how communities are coming together to fight against dirty data centers. I am joined today by the brilliant civil rights lawyer and environmental justice advocate, Abre Conner, who I have had the privilege of calling a friend and mentor. We first met in 2022 at the National NAACP convention, where I was invited to speak on a panel about environmental justice. And I'm pretty sure that was like your first week on the job. And it's like kind of crazy that like we're still here doing fun things together. And can you please just introduce yourself to our audience?
Yes, hi, I'm Abre Conner. She, her pronouns. I am the director for the Center for Environmental and Climate Justice at the NAACP. And my work basically consists of ensuring that we try to dismantle environmental and climate injustice and racism that we see systemically show up across the country and globally.
These days, among many other things, the NAACP is one of the organizations leading the fight against AI data centers, which are already following a trend of causing and perpetuating disproportionate levels of harm in communities of color to create benefits for everyone else. So, Abre, it is an honor to have you here on The Joy Report. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm just honored to be here with you, Arielle, and just appreciate all the work that you continue to do in this space, and just happy to be here.
Yay! So the first question that we always ask everyone on The Joy Report is, how have you been sustaining your joy lately?
Yeah, I think that right now it is important to find those moments and things, whether or not they're big or small, to be excited about. And I think what's sustaining my joy right now is seeing people come together
Yeah.
to discuss, like how we fight back against authoritarianism in a way that gives me a lot of hope, but it
Yeah.
also gives me a lot of joy. Like where, like people are seeing what this moment means
Yes.
and responding. And so I'm
Yeah.
excited.
People are ready, and it feels like more than ever before. So I can definitely relate to that being a source of joy right now. And so, for listeners who don't know, the NAACP is one of the oldest and most renowned human rights organizations in the U.S., sustaining the legacy of civil rights icons, including W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the first editor of the NAACP magazine, The Crisis, which is the nation's oldest African-American publication, and Thurgood Marshall, who led the NAACP's legal defense fund and used litigation to fight Jim Crow laws and dismantle segregation, and so many others. So as a legacy civil rights organization, I think it is so wonderful and inspiring that the NAACP even has an environmental and climate justice center, because so many organizations still don't see the connection between civil rights and environmental justice. So can you just give our listeners a brief overview of what the EJ and climate work at the NAACP is focused on, and why you think this work being situated at a civil rights organization is so important?
Yeah. Well, to your point, I think that it is so important for us to really be seeing environmental and climate justice issues within the civil rights
Yeah.
lens, right? Because if we don't go planet, how can we really talk about any of these other issues?
Exactly.
And I think that is just like at its foundational level, right? One of the reasons why it's so important for us to be like, I think that all organizations have to think about, our commitment and how we play a role. But we also, even back in the early stages of, before there was a term environmental justice or climate justice, we saw in, Black communities that the citing for pollution was being concentrated there more
Yeah.
heavily. And in Warren County, North Carolina,
Yep.
right? The NAACP actually stood with the community members there to say, you're not going to be dumping,
Yeah.
PCBs, Brooklyn's landfill into a Black community,
Right.
right? And so I think that gave us the foundation. And now we continue to, focus on like what this means in this moment, making sure that we have a toxic free environment, sustainable community disaster resilience work, energy justice and energy democracy type of work within our communities, and making sure, that we are not actually furthering our dependence on fossil
Yeah.
fuels, but ensuring that we are removing that dependence, because we know that all of these things together has led to the climate crisis that we're in now, and that our communities are facing and bearing the brunt of those decisions, because for many years people have told them that they could be sacrifice
Right.
zones while other communities can benefit and profit off of their hurt.
Absolutely. And, we're recording this episode a few days before Martin Luther King Day. And, there has always been a connection between civil rights and environmental justice and environmental action. And, many people cite the Warren County protests, which happened in 1982, as the start of the EJ movement. I personally take it a bit further back in time and consider the Memphis, Tennessee sanitation strike, which is where MLK did his last speech, his I've been to the mountaintop speech, to be the kind of start of the environmental justice movement here in the US. So yeah, this work is inextricably linked to civil rights. And that's why I think it's so important that the NAACP even has, someone like you leading the charge to advance their civil rights, but also their environmental justice work. So
Can I say one thing about the
yeah,
MLK piece? Because that is such an
yes,
important connection,
definitely.
right? That oftentimes does not get flagged. But I also think that the conversation around a just
Mm-hmm.
transition and having labor, a part of
Yeah.
the environmental and climate justice conversation, like sometimes people think that that's a new or innovative or novel way for us to be thinking about this
Yeah.
work, but it's really been baked in between Memphis to the grape worker strikes in the Central Valley of
Yep.
California. Like those connections have been there for a long time and really inform how we are supposed to do this work
Yes.
in community, interconnectedly, intersectionally, so that we can ensure that at the community level that people benefit.
Absolutely. So, we are here to talk about data centers. ABI research anticipates that nearly 9,000 data centers will be in operation by the year 2030. So, can you describe to our listeners what the main issue is with data centers currently and how and where they're being sited right now?
Yeah. So I think at just a high level, one of the things that became immediately clear when we first recognized that this was an area we really wanted to make sure we were prioritizing
Mm-hmm.
was that a lot of the conversation around AI was happening as though it wasn't this physical infrastructure at
Right.
all. Like people were like,
It's like a
AI, like it's in the
cloud.
cloud
Yes. Yeah,
somewhere.
exactly.
And so I think one of the concerns before we get into like the actual issues of the actual infrastructure
Mm-hmm.
itself is the connection that needs to be made more inextricably to what it means when you type in that question into an AI
Yep.
chatbot. When you type that question in, it is linked to a physical infrastructure that lives
Yeah.
somewhere. And that the more requests that go into, AI types of, you know,
Yeah.
modes, that then creates more of a demand for there to be hyperscale data centers that are actually being built in the community. So
Mm-hmm.
just at a high level, I think that is like a concern,
Definitely.
challenge thing for us to make sure that we continue to like hone in
Yeah.
on. The infrastructure itself too, especially because a lot of these data centers are these hyperscale data centers, they use a ton of water,
Yeah.
right? you have to cool the data center because it's running so much that it takes a lot of water in order to actually cool these data centers and for other
Yep.
processes to keep the data center operational. Now,
And it's not just
where
any
they're
water.
actually
We should
cited,
also make clear that it's not just
exactly,
any water. It's
yeah,
like water that is potable and we could and should be drinking and using it for human consumption and human use. It's not like they can use runoff from
exactly.
somewhere.
Exactly, exactly. And the places that they're putting these data
Mm-hmm.
centers, right, where they're siting them are typically in places where they are facing a number of other issues where their water treatment plant, for example, may already needs to be
Right.
updated. That same treatment plant that is supposed to be utilized for the community now has to run, you know, so much water to a data
Right.
center instead of it going to your point,
Yeah.
right? And so I think that's one area. Like it is also the contamination that comes to that water for you, to the point that you
Right.
made as well. And so it's like, the community, of course, is left to bear the brunt of not having access to those resources. The energy, that is needed to run these data centers
Mhm.
is so much
Yeah.
that it's concerning a lot of, at the local level, at the state level, there's a lot of questions that are being asked, right? Typically, because the data centers are so large, that means that the grid itself has to be updated or modeled differently because a grid is meant to serve a certain number of people
Right.
within that grid.
Right.
You have a data center, it is, they consider it like a new person, right? But it's oftentimes using as much, if not more, energy than the entire, grid that it was supposed to support.
Yeah.
That costs a lot of money whenever they have to redo those grids. So the current ratepayers then are left to hold the bill for updating the grid,
Mm.
right? So then that means that you and the community are having to pay for the data center to come into your community.
Yeah.
And if the grid can't support it, then that means that maybe your electricity might not be, working as well because this grid now has to support this data center. And we also know that most of them run on, fossil
Yep.
fuels. And, even for the ones that are saying that they're not, if you ask them about their backup generators,
Mm.
they're typically diesel.
Wow.
And so there are fossil fuels that are typically being utilized, heavily, increasing the use of fossil fuels in a community. And if they are building these data centers in places where there's existing
Mm-hmm.
infrastructure, say coal-fired power plants, or places where there's a lot of industrial build out, guess where those places typically are? In places that have been sacrifice
Right.
zones. So our frontline communities, Black communities, other communities who have been seen to be, left out of the environmental and climate conversations in the past. And so in places where they already might be in non-attainment for, air quality issues at at a national
Yeah.
level, then now is adding more pollution into those communities.
Right.
And typically they're running 24 hours a day. And then the noise, I'd say, is the last thing. A lot of people who live near a lot of these data centers complain about how noisy it is, that it's literally something that makes it hard for them to be able to stay in their residence because of the constant noise that comes from these data centers
Wow.
as well. So then at a high level, just some of the concerns.
Yeah.
And then the last,
No, no.
I mention one last thing, transparency. A lot of these, tech companies and the utilities as well are doing a lot of backroom deals
Mm.
to get data centers online as quickly as possible.
Interesting.
And then it's eroding, public trust as it relates to a lot of these
Yeah,
decisions.
and limits public involvement, right? Like a lot of these
Yes.
things, the community is not consenting to these data centers coming into their spaces and don't have any say in how that's happening, when it's happening, and end up having to bear so many costs, not just financial costs, but costs to their health and their livelihoods. So yeah, this is a big challenge that we're fighting against right now. And I know that the NAACP is currently fighting against data centers that are already in operation and also those that are being sited across the country. And from what I understand, the first one that you and your team began working on was in Memphis, Tennessee. And so, would you be able to share about how the organization first got involved with this issue?
So we, first learned about what Elon Musk and XAI, what they were doing in Memphis from local community groups in our branch in our state
Hmm.
conference in Memphis and Tennessee,
Yeah.
respectively. And they had highlighted, that the community had been showing up at city council meetings, showing up at different, in different spaces, saying, number one, we don't need any more pollution
Yeah.
in South Memphis, right? Like the community had just come off of fighting a pipeline just a couple years
Hmm.
before and had some of the worst air quality in the country. And so there was a lot of concern about this, hyperscale data center being built in the community.
Sure.
But what also caught our attention was that instead of XAI, going through the typical process of trying to get a permit to get the data center running and then waiting for the permit to be granted, they decided to just run unregulated methane gas turbines to run the data center in this historically Black community. And we thought that it was really important for people to see the connections between, these tech billionaires who, were getting involved now into spaces where there are clear environmental climate justice concerns and a lack of consideration or care for the law
Mm.
or for the
Yeah.
people who they are harming. So we first tried to actually send a letter to the company, to the public
Mm.
utility, and to local and county elected officials in the health department for the county who oversaw air quality issues.
Okay.
And what was interesting to us was that the public utility tried to respond and say that they didn't in any way have anything to do with how public utilities were being used for a data center within their jurisdiction. And
Interesting.
so, so we were like, okay, this is, we really need to make sure that we're doubling down in this moment
Yeah.
because this is a huge concern. So we filed with the Southern Environmental Law Center a notice of intent to sue,
Hmm.
which under certain types of laws, you have to give notice, like a 60-day notice. And this is one of those under the Clean Air
Hmm.
Act, basically saying that XAI had been violating the Clean Air
Right.
Act by running these unregulated gas turbines. And so that was, I think it was important for the community to know that we stood with them at that
Yeah.
time and were willing to take on, you know, Elon Musk and XAI at a time where they were clearly trying to double down on their stance as it related to, running these unregulated gas turbines. And two things that have happened since then, the health department also granted them a permit shortly after, basically saying that, they were a minor source of pollution, even though they were running all these gas
A
turbines.
minor
Um,
source.
minor
Interesting.
source.
Okay.
That was
Quite.
interesting, and we appealed that, and we're like, "No, this is there's a lot of pollution that's coming from this
Yeah.
data center, and you should permit accordingly." But then the EPA also this week, one of the reasons that XAI had claimed that they could run these gas turbines unregulated was they claimed that they somehow had some exemption that the EPA had granted
Oh,
them to run their gas turbines, for this last over a
wow.
year. And the EPA actually recently said there's no exemption. So
Making stuff
we're
up. Got
excited.
it. Okay.
We're making stuff
Huh.
up and we're excited, that even though the companies and even some of the, folks local government folks were trying to tell the community and tell advocates that they were wrong, that, we continue to stand with the community and say, no, this is the law and they need to follow it.
Yeah.
And we're not going to back down regardless of what other people might try to do.
Good. That is That's hopeful. That's giving me joy. I don't know. Thank you for sharing that. And I know that your office also recently released a playbook for frontline communities to stop dirty data centers. So, would you be able to just share a little bit of what's inside the playbook and how your team developed this crucial resource, which we will have linked to the show notes of this episode so people can see it for themselves as well?
Yeah. Well, when we sent that notice of intent to sue, one of the things that it also opened was the floodgates of emails and texts and messages from our branches and our state conferences in other parts of the country, but also like our partners and coalitions that we're a part
Yeah.
of saying, hey, like we're facing similar types of issues in our
Yeah.
communities. And like we don't know like what exactly to do. Like what like we're figuring this
Right.
out. We had a convening where we met with our branch state conference leadership, partner organizations and coalition partners to develop a frontline framework.
Okay.
And that frontline framework gave notice as to how we as community advocates expect to be engaged when it comes to data center build outs in our
Awesome.
communities, high level principles. But it also opened up a conversation about the need for us to be strategizing, meeting regularly, figuring out what are those patterns, because, we want to make sure that we are being proactive and not just responding to what's happening in this moment.
Right.
And so that's what led to our December Stop Dirty Data convening, where we wanted to build on what we know has been happening across the country, some of what we've been involved
Mm-hmm.
in, but utilizing that framework and saying, okay, what have we seen now that, this full year has of, data centers being really rapidly escalated across the country? And how do we make sure that in 2026 we continue to unite in this moment? And so we came up with like some guiding targets for how, there was breakout sessions regionally, conversations with experts as well, and based on the patterns that we saw. So high level, to call for a moratorium when it's needed, to push for more transparency,
Yeah.
to identify in track projects, to show up locally. And so we developed some public education documents as
Mm-hmm.
well, and then to lead from within. And so part of that is, recognizing like we're in a midterm year,
Yeah.
as well. Like
Right.
schools should be running for offices that help to shape these decisions, and flagging that is an opportunity as well for us to show up in this moment. But we highlight, a number of different ways, whether it's permitting
Mm-hmm.
reform, whether it's, thinking about what mobilization looks like at that local level, and then training opportunities to guide what we can be focusing on at a national level at this moment.
Yeah, it's so exciting and inspiring to hear that this playbook was developed in a way that is akin to what created the 17 Principles of Environmental Justice, where a bunch of environmental justice leaders from across the country came together and noticed that there was a problem that needed to be solved, and it wasn't being solved in the government. They recognized that it had to be something that came from the ground up, and there needed to be some tangible and clear takeaways from that convening that could help lead a movement. So yeah, that's what we need more of. So thank you for creating something like that and leading in such an important way. So I'm curious, why is it important right now for the public to be informed about the impacts of data centers, especially people who aren't necessarily living close to any that are currently in existence?
I think that right now we are in a time where if a data center hasn't shown up in your community, there's a high chance that that's not going to be the case for very
Yeah.
long. So even just from like that hyper self perspective,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's recognizing the signs, because some of it, is that it might not necessarily look like a data center is there yet, but there might be, conversation about a power plant being built or transmission lines being, modified in a certain type of way or rezoning happening, because we've also seen strategies to try to, piecemeal certain parts of building a data center and doing it in a way to try to keep people from asking questions about those decisions,
Interesting.
which then makes it easier to fast track when the data center actually shows up in the community.
Wow.
So that's just one part. The other reason is kind of what I had alluded to before when it comes to, cost and affordability at this
Yeah.
time, where where people are asking questions about like why their utility bills are so
Yep.
high. Why are they paying so much for resources? And part of it isn't even about the data center having to be in your community. If there are conversations about a data center potentially coming into your community, as I flagged, if they, if they model out what that grid might look like, the current ratepayers are paying for that unless there are ratepayer protections that are in place, regardless of if the data center and the company says, yes, we actually want to move forward with the proposal that has been put forth to us. So some of it is literally people paying for the possibility of more pollution in their community. And so that is, something to really, monitor. And overall, I would say that we don't have an administration that has proven to care in any way, shape, or form about what our planet looks like in the future, whether or not we're going to solve this climate crisis, and whether or not we're deepening the issues that come with global warming. Just like within the last couple of weeks, I think that was clear by pulling out of all of our international climate agreements and conversations that need to be happening to ensure that we have accountability across the world when it comes to environmental and climate decision making. And so when we don't necessarily have that structure from the federal government, from, the Trump administration, then all of these actions are going to play a role in what our emissions look like at a global level. And the more that at the local level, at the people power level, we can create our own structures, our own mechanisms to make sure that we are not, that we are doing our part to say, we're going to hold polluters accountable. We're going to hold billionaires accountable who are trying to pollute in our communities. That also gives us some agency, regardless of who's in office in the White House right now.
Absolutely. Because the work must continue regardless. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Are there other data centers and projects that we should be aware of right now? And so you already started to kind of indicate that there are some signs that might be like, signals before a data center is even being sited or constructed. But are there any that are currently in progress right now that more people should be aware of?
I'll give a couple examples of just some of the things that we've seen happen that have been of concern. So in Bessemer, Alabama, which is right outside of Birmingham, predominantly Black community, there were conversations that were happening behind NDA to keep, in my opinion, to keep the public from being able to engage on what was happening, whether it was at the planning commission level and at the city council level. And this isn't, a small data center. It's a hyperscale, one of the largest data centers that at the time when people found out about it is being considered across the country. And people could not get information, just basic information like meeting minutes, when the meetings were happening, and as it related to this data center being built out. And then the little pieces of information that people got, like basically showing that it was going to be such a large hyperscale data center, indicated that the community who already was facing a lot of air pollution issues, water issues in the community, that this was definitely going to be an environmental and climate
Mm.
injustice to the people who live there. And I think that, flagging, that we're seeing elected officials sign NDAs or have these backroom deals in a way that makes it really hard for the community who, when they did find out, were like, we don't want this data
Yeah.
center in our community, that those kinds of, actions are happening across the country. And when the community showed up at some of the critical city council
Hmm.
meetings, the city council then responded with, oh, well, you all don't have all the information.
Well,
But I think it's important to highlight that because it felt like a strategic move to try to keep
mm,
people from getting
sure.
information. And then when they get engaged, to be like, oh, you all don't understand what's happening. I mean, we even filed a public record request, and it took them almost 5 months to give us just some basic, it's not even all
Yeah.
of it, just basic information after multiple requests. The other, I would say, in Fort Wayne,
Hmm.
Indiana, there was a tech company who decided to do a piecemeal approach to try to get their data center built in Fort Wayne. And much of the construction, whether it's on the transmission line that needed to be built over for the data
Hmm.
center, and as well as other places for the actual build out of the data center, is on protected
Mm.
wetlands. And I think that it's just a little ironic to me that, at a time when we're in the midst of a climate crisis, that this company would choose to build on protected wetlands and then claim that possibly it could be restored after the construction. And even though there's not scientific evidence to prove that that would be the
Right.
case.
Right. Are there some successes that you feel like, or things that are keeping you hopeful in the fight against data centers right now that you'd be able to share?
I think that the point that I had flagged earlier about the EPA basically saying that XAI is not in the gas turbines that they had are not
Yeah.
exempt. I think that that's a major, a major
It's huge.
change
Yeah.
in how, yeah, into how, you know, tech companies who are trying, who in my opinion have kind of been bad
Yeah.
actors, how they are going to engage with communities. Because, if these loopholes that they claim exist, that there's not any, backing for
Yeah.
that, well, then now what are you going to
Right.
do? And so I think that it's a huge win because the community had been involved, never changed their position. And now there's the EPA, final rule that also indicates that the community is right.
Excellent. So there is still a lot of uncertainty around what we can do as humans to protect ourselves and our loved ones from the impacts of data centers. So, what are some things that the everyday person can do to continue to support the fight against these dirty data centers?
Right now is really the time to lock in at the local
Yeah.
level, to go these planning commission meetings, these zoning commission meetings, to show up at your city council meetings, to push them, to do reporting and investigate and assess whether or not the community can actually withstand that much of a
Right.
change at that moment, right? Sometimes people think that there has to be an agendized
Hmm.
item to be able to discuss a concern or an issue, but you don't
Not at
need that.
all.
They have to have, public comment
Yep.
period, and you can organize at your local
Hmm.
level around that public comment period time and talk about whatever concerns are important to you. And the more that they hear about a specific concern, then they also have to agendize that
Right.
item to be like, this is something that we consistently keep
Yep.
hearing is a problem at our community level. And so now we need to direct staff to actually help us to understand this issue
Yeah.
better Also the more that you can go to them with the demands. We have, some of them, again, to your point,
Hmm.
Ariel, in our recommendations for this
Yeah.
year, as well as the frontline framework, and to direct them to those things, then that can help to drive the conversation that needs to continue to happen, that the everyday person, you don't have to fly to DC to
Right.
engage in those conversations. And then also to, think about our choices as it relates to when we're seeing AI, and when, there are, you know, ask from some of these companies. I know I get them now. They're like, "Oh, would you like to turn on all these smart features?"
Yeah.
Think quote. That's how we engage with the demand for it at this time can also help to inform the future of the dependence that seems to be also part of this conversation of data centers.
Definitely. So it sounds like educating ourselves, showing up, like organizing at a local level, and saying no and resisting the use of generative AI as much as possible are some of those main things that we can do as individuals. How can our audience stay connected with you and your work and the work that the Climate and Environmental Justice Center at the NAACP is doing?
So we have, a general environmental climate justice page and a Stop Dirty Data
Hmm.
page on our website. I also, will post things from time to time on my socials. So my personal social, our NAACP social, we flag different things that are happening, different issues that are coming up. I think that's also a good way as well. Sometimes, it might take a little bit longer for it to make it through all the different
Sure.
ways, but trying to like keep people up to date in that way, and also to join the NAACP as well. We have environmental and climate justice chairs at local level and at a state level, and we meet with them and we share information out with them and messaging alignment that's helpful for meeting this moment as well.
And so, our final question for you for today is, what is something in the news or in your recent discoveries that has brought you joy lately? And it can be about data centers, about anything else that's happening in the world.
Something that has brought me
Hmm.
joy. Oh, the news is such an interesting
It
place right
is. It
now, right?
is.
But I think there's something that's brought me joy kind of within that space. And it's not, I honestly, I'm going to say it's not necessarily related to
It's
data
okay.
centers, but it's more relating to
Yeah.
storytelling in this moment, is how you have folks who come from, Black communities and other communities represented within the global majority, who are really taking back their
Hmm.
voice in being able to create stories and narratives that are reflective of our
Yeah.
experiences, as opposed to having other people share our experiences for us. And I think that I've seen a lot more of that
Yeah.
recently, and I'm really excited about how that fits in to, you know, like this resistance time right now in this moment.
Mhm. Yeah, independent media is having a moment right now, especially when all of these major publications are, being bought out and censored and
Yeah.
lots of other scary things happening. So, yeah, I mean, that's why we are so excited and grateful to have you on the podcast today. So, thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise and just all of the work that you continue to do to advance environmental justice here in the US and beyond. So, thank
Yeah,
you.
well, thank you so much for having me, and Ariel. As always, it's just always a pleasure to be able to have time to
I
chat with you,
know.
and to just see how you are really amplifying and being an activist and in this work and in this space. So appreciate you so
Thank
much.
you. And listeners, if you enjoyed and or learned something from this episode, please consider leaving us a review, sharing it with at least one friend, keeping the conversation going by posting about it on social media and tagging us. Make sure you're following Intersectional Environmentalist on Instagram, YouTube, and Substack so you don't miss any updates. And remember, fighting the climate crisis is a marathon, not a sprint. We need everyone to get involved in a way that feels right for them now more than ever. Our individual positive actions do have power, and they're strengthened when we do them as a collective. I'm your host, Arielle V. King, and thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Joy Report.